The Unborn Archive. The air inside St. Holloway Medical Center was a mausoleum's breath, chilled, heavy, and smelling of something long past its expiration. Evan Brooks stood in the cavernous, dust-choked lobby, the echoes of his own footsteps swallowed by the vast, silent space. The building, a hulking monolith of blackened brick and grimy limestone, squatted on the forgotten edge of Chicago's industrial district, its vacant windows like cataract-blind eyes staring out at nothing. For decades, it had been a monument to obsolescence, a forgotten sentinel of illness and despair. Now it was his domain. His assignment was simple, in theory: digitize the archived patient records, a last-ditch effort by the city to salvage whatever historical data might be hidden within the hospital's decaying walls. But even the paperwork for this project felt begrudging, as if St. Holloway itself resisted documentation. The facility had been shuttered abruptly in the late 80s, a whisper of scandal following its closure, though no one Evan spoke to could quite recall the specifics beyond a vague mention of unethical practices and a ward that simply vanished from the blueprints. A maternity ward, some speculated, but no one ever truly confirmed it. Evan had always dismissed it as urban legend, the kind of macabre folklore that clung to abandoned places like mold. He consulted the crumpled schematic provided by the city. His workstation wasn't in one of the grand, echoing surgical theaters or the desolate patient rooms, but in the deepest subterranean levels, the sub-basement archives, as the blueprint vaguely labeled it. It was a place designed for forgetting. The service elevator, a rusty cage groaning on ancient cables, felt like a descent into the Earth's cold maw. Each floor it passed was darker, colder, more decrepit than the last. The air thickened, pressing in, carrying faint metallic tangs that evoked sterile procedures and dried blood, overlaid with the cloying sweetness of decay. When the elevator finally shuddered to a halt, the doors scraped open onto absolute blackness. Evan fumbled for his industrial-grade flashlight, its beam cutting a stark path through the inky void. The sub-basement was a labyrinth of low-ceiling corridors, each lined with floor-to-ceiling shelving units overflowing with moldering boxes and bound ledgers.
The fluorescent lights, where they existed, flickered like dying embers, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe just at the periphery of his vision. The cold here was absolute, seeping into his bones, a damp, pervasive chill that no amount of heavy clothing could truly ward off. It was the cold of deep earth, of forgotten things. His workspace was a small, alcove-like room, barely wider than the collapsible table he'd brought with him. It was a temporary island of modern technology amidst an ocean of obsolete paperwork. He set up his laptop, scanner, and a portable LED lamp, its stark white light pushing back against the oppressive gloom. The hum of his equipment was a fragile counterpoint to the profound silence that otherwise dominated the space, a silence so complete it felt less like an absence of sound and more like a presence, a watchful entity holding its breath. He began the tedious process of unpacking the first few boxes. They were heavy, dense with paper, and exhaled clouds of fine, acrid dust when opened. The smell was immediate and overwhelming, the pungent, clinical odor of antiseptic, sharp and clean, yet somehow corrupted by the underlying stench of damp earth and something indefinably organic. It wasn't the smell of mildew, nor simply stale paper. It was deeper, more unsettling, like a faint, sickly sweet perfume trying to mask a slow, inexorable rot. He tried to ignore it, attributing it to decades of forgotten biohazards and poor ventilation. Evan, a man of meticulous habits and pragmatic logic, found solace in the methodical nature of his work. He'd spent years digitizing municipal records, old police reports, dusty library archives. He understood the past, or at least its documented version. His job was to bring order to chaos, to transform brittle paper into digital permanence. The first few batches of files were unremarkable: appendectomies, broken bones, pneumonia cases, all neatly dated and filed. He scanned page after page, the soft whir of the machine a rhythmic pulse in the suffocating quiet. His eyes, accustomed to deciphering faded ink and archaic medical jargon, moved efficiently. Then he found the first anomaly. It was a small, unassuming chart tucked between a meningitis case from '78 and a routine tonsillectomy from '79. The cover read, "Patient Infant F12, female." Evan frowned. The numbering convention was unusual, more typically reserved for research subjects than standard patients.
He opened it. The chart was sparse. Diagnosis: congenital malformation, unspecified. Treatments: observation. Prognosis: undetermined. But what struck him was the glaring omission. The entire section for date of birth was blank, not smudged, not illegible, but simply empty. Below it, date of admission was also blank. There was a handwritten entry for date of discharge, but it read only dash. A dash. No date, no signature, no explanation. He paused, a faint prickle of unease tracing his spine. "Clerical error," he muttered, trying to reassure himself. Old hospitals, especially those facing closure, often had sloppy record-keeping. He made a mental note to flag it, then continued scanning. But then came another, and another. Patient, M7, male, blank birth date, blank admission date, discharge, dash, diagnosis, developmental agenesis. Patient, F21, female, blank birth date, blank admission date, discharge, dash, diagnosis, spiritual impurity suspected. Evan stopped cold. Spiritual impurity? That was beyond archaic. It was medieval. He reread the entry, certain he'd misread it in the dim artificial light, but there it was, scrolled in faded blue ink. He felt a shiver unrelated to the cold. He pushed the pile of anomalous charts aside, a separate stack forming on his table. They were all infants, all with these unsettling numerical designations, all missing the most fundamental piece of identification, their beginning. They were simply there, and then they were simply not. No record of life, no record of death, just a fleeting ghostly presence within the hospital's ledgers. The silence of the sub-basement pressed in tighter. The hum of his scanner seemed to grow louder, then recede, replaced by the faint, distant drip of water somewhere in the labyrinthine darkness. His breath plumed in the cold air, each exhalation a tiny, visible cloud. The antiseptic and rot smell seemed to intensify, clinging to his throat, a constant reminder of the unseen things lurking in the shadowed corners of this forgotten place. He tried to dismiss the growing dread. It was just old files, cryptid language, the quirks of a hospital from another era. But the sheer volume of these undocumented infants was becoming alarming. He had already found dozens. What kind of hospital kept records of patients who were never officially born, never officially discharged, never officially ceased to be?
His eyes drifted to a sealed door at the far end of his alcove, indistinguishable from the other heavy metal doors that lined the corridor, save for a faint rusted plate that once might have held a designation. There was no light under it, no sound behind it, but a peculiar cold seemed to emanate from its surface, colder than the ambient chill. He found himself staring at it, a nascent, uncomfortable intuition stirring within him. It felt like a barrier, like a secret. As he reached for another box, his hand brushed against a stack of the infant charts. They felt colder than the surrounding paper, almost clammy, as if they held a residual chill from the unseen patients they represented. He pulled one from the stack, his fingers tracing the blank space where a birth date should have been. Infant M16, male. No birth, no death. Just an entry into an unseen ledger. A faint, almost imperceptible current of air brushed past his face, carrying with it a concentrated burst of that sickly sweet antiseptic-laced decay. It was so distinct, so immediate, that he recoiled, his heart thudding against his ribs. He spun around, shining his flashlight into the empty corridor, but found nothing, only the dancing dust motes in the beam, the oppressive shadows, and the unwavering, profound silence. He was alone, yet the feeling of being observed was palpable, a phantom weight on his shoulders. The files weren't just data, they felt like testimonies. The hospital wasn't just abandoned, it felt like it was holding its breath, a vast cold maw waiting for him to swallow the truth of its forgotten children. He looked down at the chart in his hand, at the blank spaces, the phantom life it represented. The thought, cold and clear as the air around him, solidified. These records weren't just incomplete, they were empty, deliberately so, and something in this place was waiting for him to notice.
He started a separate digital folder, Anomalous Infant Records, meticulously scanning each one. The cold, logical part of his brain still tried to rationalize. Experimental ward, unusual record-keeping, perhaps a protocol for stillbirths that were never officially registered. But the recurring diagnosis of spiritual impurity gnawed at him, a splinter of the inexplicable lodged deep in his professional skepticism. What kind of medical institution diagnosed spiritual ailments? And what kind of treatment could be administered to an unborn child deemed spiritually impure? The air grew heavier with each passing hour, the blend of antiseptic and rot now a constant presence, sometimes sharpening to a metallic tang, sometimes sweet and cloying like overripe fruit left too long in the dark. It clung to his clothes, seeped into his skin, settled in the back of his throat. He tried opening ventilation shafts, but they were all sealed, rusted shut. The sub-basement was a sealed tomb, its air thick with the history it held. One afternoon, as the LED lamp cast its stark, unwavering light on a yellow chart, infant F33, female, Diagnosis, innate corruption. A sound, faint and thin, seemed to drift from the very walls around him. It was high-pitched, fragile, like a kitten's mewl, but imbued with an ancient, profound sorrow. Evan froze. Scanner paused mid-whir. He tilted his head, straining to hear. Nothing. Only the low hum of his equipment and the beat of his own blood in his ears. "Just the pipes," he murmured aloud, his voice sounding brittle and thin in the vast quiet. Old building settling. He tried to convince himself, but the sound had been too specific, too raw. He resumed scanning, but his attention was fractured. He found himself glancing more frequently at the sealed door at the end of his alcove, its cold presence a constant silent accusation. He tried to ignore the growing intuition that these infant records were not merely incomplete, but were fragments of a deliberately forgotten narrative, a story that St. Holloway Medical Center was unwilling, or perhaps unable, to fully relinquish. The next unsettling incident came less subtly. He was processing a particularly dense stack of the anomalous charts, reading names aloud as he entered them into his digital log. Infant M47, Infant F19, Infant M82, male, congenital defilement.
As the last word left his lips, the portable LED lamp flickered violently, then died, plunging his small workspace into absolute darkness. Evan gasped, his chair scraping back as he lurched away from the table. The sudden, profound blackness was suffocating, thick like velvet. He fumbled frantically for his industrial flashlight, his heart hammering against his ribs. When its powerful beam finally pierced the gloom, illuminating his trembling hands, the LED lamp remained stubbornly off. He checked the plug, the outlet. Everything seemed fine, yet it was dead. Power surge, he reasoned, his voice a little too loud, a little too shaky. He unplugged the lamp, then plugged it back in. Nothing. He tried another outlet. Still nothing. The lamp, which had worked flawlessly for days, was now inert. A chill, sharper and more invasive than the ambient cold, swept through the alcove. It wasn't the cold of the building. It felt directed, a breath against his skin. The air thickened with the smell of antiseptic and rot, now so potent it made his eyes water. He could almost taste it, metallic and sweet, on his tongue. He had read a name aloud, and the light had died. The connection, however irrational, was a cold knot in his stomach. He spent the rest of the day using only his flashlight and the dim glow of his laptop screen, the shadows around him long and restless, constantly shifting. He found himself whispering the names of the infants, afraid to give them full voice, afraid of what might happen next. The phantom cries returned too. This time they were clearer, more sustained, like a chorus of fragile, distant laments. They seemed to echo from deep within the walls, from places that should have been solid brick and concrete, from rooms that officially didn't exist. They were heartbreaking, chilling, a sound that spoke of innocence and profound suffering. Evan pushed his headphones over his ears, blasting white noise, but even then he could almost hear them, a high-pitched, keening undertone beneath the static. He realized he needed to understand the physical layout of the hospital better, specifically the rumored maternity ward. If these infants were never officially born, yet their charts existed, where were they housed? Where were these experiments conducted? He left his workstation, his flashlight beam sweeping through the dusty corridors, the shadows retreating, then rushing back in its wake.
He found a set of faded, peeling blueprints tacked to a water-stained wall in a larger, abandoned office area on the sub-basement level. The paper was brittle, flaking at his touch. He traced the lines with his finger, identifying the storage areas, the old boiler room, the foundation points. And then he found it. A section of the sub-basement, directly above his current location, marked Restricted Access, Annex B. On the blueprint, it showed a series of smaller rooms branching off as central corridor, atypical for storage or mechanicals. A faint, almost erased pencil notation next to it read, M Ward. M Ward. Maternity ward. But this was the sub-basement. What maternity ward would be buried underground, sealed away? And why was it erased from all the modern schematics, mentioned only as a whisper of scandal? Evan felt a primal dread unfurl in his chest. He looked up from the blueprint, his flashlight beam cutting across the general direction of Annex B. There, at the end of the long, dark corridor he had often walked past, was a door unlike the others. It wasn't sealed with corrugated metal, nor was it simply locked. It was bricked up, solid, mortar crumbling, brick peeking through layers of plaster and paint, as if someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase it, to deny its very existence. A wave of cold, intense, and almost tangible washed over him from the direction of the bricked-up door, and with it, the smell intensified, the sickly sweet rot now overpowering the antiseptic,
thick and cloying like funeral lilies left too long on a grave. He could almost taste iron, sharp and coppery. And then a sound. Not a cry, but a whisper so close it felt like it grazed his ear. It wasn't a human voice, not exactly. It was more like the rustle of old paper or the dry scuttling of something unseen, yet it carried an undeniable inflection, a breathy, ancient cadence. "Doctor," it seemed to sigh. Evan froze, every muscle in his body tensing. He spun around, flashlight beams sweeping wildly through the empty corridor, piercing the shadowy corners where nothing stirred. He was alone, utterly, terribly alone, yet he had heard it, clear as day, though faint as a ghost. "Doctor." His rational mind screamed hallucination, fatigue, the echo of the silence playing tricks. But the other part of him, the part that had been absorbing the blank charts, the dying lights, the phantom cries, knew better. St. Holloway wasn't just abandoned.
It was alive in its own dreadful way, and it had just spoken to him. It knew who he was, or at least what he represented. He stared at the bricked-up door, his breath hitching in his throat. It felt less like a barrier now, and more like an invitation to a place that had been deliberately excised from history, a place where infants were diagnosed with spiritual impurity and never officially born, never officially died. The cries, now a faint, consistent hum beneath the surface of his hearing, seemed to emanate directly from behind those bricks. They were waiting, and they were calling to him. Part 3. The whisper of doctor reverberated in Evan's mind, a chilling echo that refused to dissipate. It wasn't just the sound, it was the implication. He was an archivist, a cataloger of the past, not a healer of the present. Yet this place, this forgotten hospital, seemed to perceive him differently. It was a perception steeped in something ancient, something beyond the realm of medical records and rational thought. The bricked-up door to Annex B, the rumored M ward, now seemed to pulse with a dark energy. It was a scar on the face of the hospital, a wound that had never truly healed, merely covered over. The cold emanating from it intensified, raising goosebumps on Evan's arms despite the layers of clothing. The antiseptic and rot smell, too, grew more potent, a suffocating miasma that seemed to congeal in the air. He found himself drawn to it, an irresistible pull. His logical mind, usually his strongest defense, was crumbling under the relentless assault of the inexplicable. He traced the rough texture of the bricks with a trembling hand, feeling the chill seep into his fingertips. The phantom cries, previously distant, were now closer, clearer, a chorus of tiny, desperate wails that tugged at something deep within him. They were the sounds of infants, yes, but not entirely. There was an uncanny quality to them, a sustained, almost mechanical repetition that was profoundly unsettling. For 3 more days, Evan continued his work, or at least he tried to. The infant charts became his obsession. He found a ledger, bound in crumbling leather, tucked beneath a stack of administrative memos. Its pages were filled with meticulous, spidery handwriting, logging dates, procedures, and cryptic observations. Protocol 7B initiated, one entry read. Subject F14 responding to sonic stimulation, heartbeat elevated.
Maternal stress factor noted, impurity levels remain. Another, subject M22 exhibiting resistance to spiritual cleansing. Ultrasound reveals abnormal growth patterns. Ultrasound. The word snagged in his mind. He remembered seeing a notation on the sub-basement blueprint tucked away in a small windowless room near Annex B. Imaging suite, decommissioned. He found the room easily enough, a heavy steel door marked with a faded radiation symbol. The air inside was even colder, stagnant and thick with the hospital's pervasive odor. Cobwebs draped across dormant machinery, and dust lay like a shroud over everything. The ultrasound machine itself was a hulking, archaic console, its monitor screen filmed with a century of grime. Wires snaked across the floor like dead vines. It looked utterly inoperable. Evan shone his flashlight over the control panel, curious. His archivist's mind, ever keen on detail, noticed a faint, almost invisible light blinking on the power button. Impossible. The machine was unplugged, its power cable severed and wrapped in electrical tape. He reached out, his hand hovering over the button. As is sensing his intent, the screen flickered to life. A burst of static, then a grainy, black-and-white image materialized. It was an ultrasound, an image of a womb, indistinct and shimmering, a form within it. Evan gasped, stumbling back. The image wasn't human, not exactly. It was too elongated, too skeletal, with an odd pulsing quality that made his stomach churn. The shape writhed slowly, morphing at the edges, its contours indistinct, yet undeniably wrong. It was a silhouette of despair, a nascent nightmare. And then, the sound, the faint, high-pitched wails, no longer distant, now filled the room, seeming to emanate from the very machine itself, from the shadowy form on the screen. They were clearer, more piercing, layered with a guttural, desperate gasp. Evan's mind reeled. He stumbled out of the room, slamming the door shut behind him, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He leaned against the cold metal, gulping in air that still tasted of decay. He had seen something that defied all logic, all medical understanding. An ultrasound machine, long dead, showing something that should not exist, emitting sounds of pure terror. He tried to go back to his work, but the image from the screen was seared into his retina, the alien form writhing in the digital womb.
He found himself avoiding reading the infant names aloud, whispering them, or simply entering the numbers. The lights in the sub-basement had become erratic, flickering at random, sometimes dying completely for agonizing seconds, plunging him into absolute blackness before reluctantly sputtering back to life. It felt like the hospital was breathing, its decaying lungs struggling. One evening, as dusk bled through the few grimy windows far above, casting the sub-basement into deeper gloom, Evan found himself back at the bricked-up door to Annex B. He wasn't sure what compelled him, a morbid curiosity, a desperate need for answers, or perhaps something else entirely, something he couldn't name, a magnetic pull emanating from within the sealed ward. The air here was a tangible wall of cold, thick and heavy. The smell was almost unbearable, a rich, cloying sweetness that made his head ache, mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of blood. The infant cries were no longer distant. They were right here, just beyond the bricks, a chorus of sorrowful, pleading wails. They weren't angry, as he might have expected ghosts to be. They were desperate, yearning. He stood there for a long time, listening, his flashlight being fixed on a patch of crumbling mortar. He felt a profound sense of anguish, a connection to the unheard suffering behind that wall. These weren't just records, they were souls, souls trapped in a limbo of non-existence. He noticed something peculiar on the floor, directly in front of the brick-top door, a faint, almost invisible trail of moisture. He knelt, shining his light closer. It wasn't water, it was a viscous, clear fluid, leaving a faint, sickly sweet scent, and interspersed within it, tiny, almost translucent fragments, like slivers of calcified bone or brittle cartilage. It was as if something was slowly, painfully, eroding its way out from behind the wall. He shuddered, his stomach churning. He backed away slowly, his eyes fixed on the bricked barrier. As he turned to leave, a low, guttural groan echoed from deep within the brick-top ward. It was a sound of immense effort, of straining, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the building. And with it, a chorus of the infant wails rose in intensity, reaching a crescendo of desperate yearning. Then a new voice, distinct from the infant's cries, joined the cacophony.
It was a voice that whispered from the shadows, from the very air around him, closer than before, a dry, raspy utterance that felt ancient and full of something unspeakably cold. "He is ready," it hissed, the words seeming to scrape against his eardrums. "The doctor is ready." Evan froze, his blood turning to ice. He? Who was he? And ready for what? The voice wasn't speaking to him, but about him. He felt a profound, sickening realization dawn on him. This wasn't just a haunting. He wasn't just an observer. He was part of it. He was being drawn into a purpose he didn't understand, a dreadful, unspeakable purpose. He could feel eyes on him, countless unseen eyes, watching, waiting. The hospital was a single, vast living entity, and he was now caught in its terrible, ancient mechanism. The bricked-up door seemed to pulse, its silence now screaming an invitation.
He had to know what was behind it. He had to. Part 4. The pronouncement, "He is ready, the doctor is ready," was a turning point. A cold blade plunged into the last vestiges of Evan's skepticism. The hospital's consciousness, whatever horrific form it took, had acknowledged him, categorized him. He was no longer merely Evan Brooks, medical archivist. He was the doctor, and his readiness, whatever it implied, filled him with a dread that eclipsed any fear he had known. The bricked-up door to Annex B, the M ward, now seemed less a barrier and more a threshold. The faint, viscous trail on the floor, interspersed with brittle fragments, had widened slightly, tracing a subtle path from the wall toward the center of the corridor. The infant cries pulsed with an almost physical rhythm, a desperate chorus of yearning, laced with that primal, guttural groaning he'd heard before. It was a sound of immense, agonizing effort, as if something gargantuan was trying to birth itself through solid rock. Sleep became a distant memory. Evan subsisted on caffeine and adrenaline, his mind a whirlwind of fragmented thoughts. The records of spiritual impurity, the blank birth dates, the phantom ultrasound, the whispers of doctor, they coalesced into a terrifying narrative, a story of unspeakable experiments conducted in the deep, dark heart of St. Holloway. He saw the faces of the doctors in the old photographs he'd found, stern, unsmiling men in starched white, their eyes holding a chilling zeal. What had they sought to treat in these unborn children? What had they hoped to achieve?
He found himself drawn inexorably to the bricked-up door. The air around it hummed with an almost electrical charge, thick with the cloying sweetness of rot and the metallic tang of something ancient and vital. The faint trail on the floor, the viscous fluid, was now more pronounced, stretching further into the corridor, almost to his feet. It looked like amniotic fluid, corrupted and stained, leaving behind those horrifying calcified fragments. He ran his hand over the bricks again, feeling the subtle vibrations that pulsed within them. He needed to get in. He had to. The urgency was no longer born of curiosity, but of a profound, primal need to understand, to alleviate the suffering that echoed from within. He tried the heavy tools he'd brought for breaking open rusted filing cabinets, a pry bar, a sledgehammer, but the bricks were set deep, the mortar ancient and unyielding. The hospital did not want to be forced open. It wanted to guide him. And guide him it did. He returned to his workstation, defeated, but as he sat down, he noticed something new. On his laptop screen, an old, forgotten file had opened itself. It was a scanned blueprint, far more detailed than the one he'd found on the wall. This one was dated much earlier, from the hospital's initial construction. It showed the original plans for Annex B. And next to the bricktop entrance, it now highlighted a small, almost invisible notation, a series of numbers, handwritten, a security code for a maintenance tunnel. Evan's blood ran cold. The hospital was actively showing him the way. It was a conscious entity manipulating its own archives, its own environment. It wasn't just haunting him, it was orchestrating him. He memorized the numbers, his heart pounding. The maintenance tunnel was a cramped, claustrophobic crawl space, barely wide enough for a man, running beneath the sub-basement. He'd seen its entrance on the blueprints, a small, unmarked grate hidden behind a stack of defunct oxygen tanks. Armed with his flashlight, a heavy wrench, and a surging, adrenaline-fueled terror, Evan crawled into the tunnel. The air was even fouler here, a compressed essence of the hospital's decay. The space was utterly dark, filled with the scuttling of unseen things, and a deafening roar of silence that made his ears ache. He moved slowly, painstakingly, the metallic tang of blood growing stronger with every inch he advanced.
He crawled for what felt like an eternity, the rough concrete scraping against his knees and elbows. The infant cries were faint here, muffled by the earth, but the guttural groaning was closer, a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through the very ground beneath him. It felt like he was crawling through the esophagus of a vast, dying beast. Finally, his flashlight beam caught something, an old, rusted steel plate bolted to the concrete floor of the tunnel. It was the access hatch, directly beneath the sealed M ward. He recognized the pattern of bolts from the blueprint. With trembling hands, he used the wrench, straining against the rusted metal. Each turn of the wrench sent a metallic screech echoing through the confined space, a sound that seemed to be answered by a sharp intake of breath from above. As the last bolt gave way, the hatch hissed, and a blast of frigid, wet air rushed out, carrying with it the overpowering smell of the cloying sweetness, the antiseptic, and something else, something profoundly organic and ancient, like wet earth and freshly turned grave soil. He pushed the hatch open, a plume of dust and cold vapor rising from the opening. He hoisted himself through, emerging into a narrow, dark space. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing his surroundings. He was in a small, circular room, barely larger than a closet, directly beneath the M ward. Above him, a grate led into the ward itself. The walls around him were damp, glistening with that same viscous fluid he'd seen outside the bricked-up door. And on the floor, scattered amongst the fluid, were more of those horrifying calcified fragments, some gleaming faintly, almost pearlescent, others dull and bone-like. The room throbbed with the sound of the infant cries, now deafening, overwhelming. They were right above him, a desperate symphony of agony and longing. And amidst them, the guttural groaning was louder, deeper, a sound of immense, sustained effort, like a vast body struggling to expel something impossible. Evan looked up at the grate above him, his breath catching in his throat. The cries seemed to be pouring through it, washing over him, pleading, desperate. He pressed his ear against the cold metal. He could hear movement, dragging sounds, wet noises. It was a frenzy of activity, unseen, unheard by the outside world for decades. And then, clear as a bell, amidst the chaos of wails and groans, a single new sound.
A voice, ancient and dry, yet filled with a terrible, expectant triumph. "The doctor has arrived," it rasped, the words seeming to fall directly from the grate, directly from the M ward above. "The delivery is nigh." Evan staggered back, hitting the damp wall. Delivery? His blood ran cold. The words, the sounds, the trail of fluid, the fragments, they converged into a single horrifying truth. These infants weren't just trapped spirits, they were waiting to be born. And he, Evan Brooks, the archivist, had been chosen, guided, prepared to be their facilitator. He wasn't just here to digitize their forgotten history, he was here to complete it. He was the doctor, and the hospital, a monstrous birthing entity, was finally going into labor. The terror that gripped him was absolute, unyielding. He was caught in a horrifying primordial ritual, and there was no escape. He was the midwife to the unborn. Part 5. The words, "The doctor has arrived, the delivery is nigh," struck Evan like a physical blow. The air in the subchamber, thick with the smell of decay and the overwhelming sweetness of that viscous fluid, became a suffocating blanket. He wasn't just observing a haunting, he was now the central figure in a monstrous, unspeakable birth. The spiritual impurity diagnosis, the blank birth dates, the ultrasound of the unhuman shape, it all clicked into a terrifying mosaic. The doctors of St. Holloway had performed experiments, not to treat, but to alter, to birth something other, something that defied the natural order, only to have their creations trapped in an endless, unfulfilled gestation. The guttural groans above intensified, shaking the very concrete. They were sounds of immense, ancient labor, mingled with the crescendo of infant wails, desperate, demanding, no longer mournful, but filled with a hungry urgency. The viscous fluid was no longer just a trail. It was weeping from the grate above, dripping onto Evan's face, warm and cloying, carrying with it the sickening sweet odor and the tiny, brittle fragments that looked disturbingly like nascent bone. He scrambled back, his mind screaming for escape, but the small chamber offered none. He was a rat in a trap, and the trap was closing. He looked up at the grate, his flashlight beams struggling against the encroaching darkness.
Through the gaps in the rusted metal, he saw movement, not distinct figures, but shifts in shadow, swirling mists that hinted at forms, spectral hands reaching, pulling, beckoning. Then a low, collective sigh rippled through the ward above, a sound of profound relief, a terrible exhalation after centuries of holding breath. The guttural groaning faded, replaced by a softer, rhythmic pulsing. The infant cries, however, reached a fever pitch, a deafening chorus of anticipation. The grate above him began to groan, the bolts that held it in place twisting and shearing with agonizing slowness. Dust and rust rained down. Evan shielded his head, his eyes fixed on the opening, his heart a frantic, trapped bird. The grate peeled back, not with a crash, but with a soft, almost surgical clink, revealing a gaping hole into the M-ward. Through the opening, a faint, unnatural light filtered down. It was not the harsh fluorescent glare of a modern operating room, but a soft, shimmering luminescence, like moonlight filtered through deep water. And in that eerie glow, Evan saw them. They were not solid, not entirely, shimmering, translucent forms, vaguely humanoid, but elongated, with limbs too long, heads slightly too large, eyes that glowed with an unsettling, ancient light. They were the spirits of the unborn, the children of St. Holloway's horrific experiments, their forms still bearing the nascent, unfinished quality of the womb. They floated, or perhaps glided around a central focal point, a pristine, antique operating table, gleaming incongruously in the spectral light. The ward itself was a perverse tableau. Old incubators, still containing faint ethereal glows, lined the walls. Medical instruments, long rusted, now shimmered with an otherworldly sheen, poised as if awaiting use. And the air was thick with expectation, with a raw, desperate yearning that was almost unbearable. The spirits turned to him, their silent gazes converging. He felt no anger from them, no malice, only an overwhelming, profound need. They were not vengeful ghosts. They were waiting, still, to be delivered. And he was their doctor. A spectral hand, long and translucent, reached down through the opening, a gesture of undeniable invitation. It was not a physical touch, but Evan felt an irresistible pull, a magnetic force drawing him upward. He scrambled, clambered, his body moving almost independently of his will, through the opening and into the M-ward.
He stood amidst the shimmering forms, the chorus of cries surrounding him, vibrating through his very bones. The operating table was before him, its surface cold and hard. The spirits began to circle him, their movements fluid and graceful, like dancers in a morbid ballet. Their collective gaze bore into him, a silent command. He felt a profound exhaustion, a surrender to the inevitable. His legs bubbled and he found himself collapsing onto the operating table. It was cold, metallic, yet strangely comforting, as if he were finally where he was meant to be. The phantom hands of the spirit settled on him, on his chest, his arms, his legs. They were cold, yet he felt a distinct pressure, a sense of being prepared, positioned. His clothes seemed to melt away, leaving him exposed. He felt an odd detachment, watching his own body as if from afar. The whispers began again, not doctor, but a new, more intimate address. "Our vessel," they chorused, their voices a blend of infant wails and the dry, ancient rasp he'd heard before. "Our beginning." He tried to move, to scream, but his limbs were heavy, his throat constricted. He could only lie there, utterly vulnerable, as the spectral figures moved around him with an eerie, practiced precision. He saw the ancient medical instruments shimmer, hovering above him, guided by unseen hands. The light in the ward brightened, becoming a blinding white glare. The cloying, sweet smell intensified, now mingled with a sharp, metallic aroma that filled his nostrils. He felt a cold, alien pressure on his abdomen,
Then a sensation of stretching, of being torn, not from the outside but from within. It was a profound violation, a sensation of his very essence being rent open. He understood now. They didn't want revenge. They didn't want to haunt. They wanted to exist, and for that they needed a body, a vessel, a form to inhabit the world they were denied. His body. A scream tore from his throat, a raw, primal sound of absolute terror and agony. It was not just his scream, it was intertwined with other sounds, a multitude of tiny, desperate wails, all merging, all becoming one. He felt something pulling, something growing within him, pushing outwards, demanding release. His body convulsed, a final, futile resistance. The white light intensified, consuming everything. The stretching, tearing sensation reached an unbearable peak.
He heard a final, collective sigh of triumph from the spirits around him, a sound of immense satisfaction. And then, a sound he had heard countless times in his life, but never with such horrific resonance. A newborn cry, high-pitched, piercing, full of life, bursting into the world. But it wasn't just a baby's cry. It was layered, impossibly, with his voice, Evan's own voice, distorted, stretched, fading. The cry of an infant and the gasp of a man, merging into a single, chilling crescendo. The sound wavered, then slowly, inexorably, flattened. It became a long, sustained tone, unwavering, cold, and utterly devoid of life. A flat line, the sound of a heart monitor reaching its final, grim conclusion. The light in the M ward dimmed, leaving only the profound silence, broken by the faint, rhythmic pulse of a single, tiny heartbeat, echoing through the empty, expectant halls of St. Holloway Medical Center. The delivery was complete.